The call came in on a Tuesday morning in February 2005. A padded envelope, no return address, no postage mark that led anywhere useful, had been left at KSAS-TV, a local Fox affiliate in Wichita, Kansas. Inside was a purple floppy disk, the 1.44 megabyte kind. The kind that had been standard office equipment in 1995 and was already a relic by 2005. Investigators brought it back to the lab, loaded it into a drive, and opened the single document stored on it. What they found in the file's metadata, the invisible layer of information that Microsoft Word embeds automatically in every document, the layer most people never think about, took approximately 30 seconds to read. The document had last been edited by a user named Dennis. The software was registered to Christ Lutheran Church in Park City, Kansas. A Google search, 30 seconds more. Dennis Rader, President of the Church Council, Park City, Kansas. 31 years, 10 murders. Thousands of interviews and hundreds of thousands of investigative hours and a task force that had been assembled, scaled back, and quietly dissolved. And at the end of all of it, a floppy disk and a man who did not understand what a Word document remembered. But to understand how that moment was possible, how a serial killer who had terrorized an entire city for 3 decades could hand himself to the people hunting him through a single avoidable mistake, you have to go back to the beginning. Not to the floppy disk, not even to the letters. You have to go back to a cold January morning in 1974, to a quiet residential street in a mid-sized American city where most people did not lock their doors, and where 4 members of one family were about to become the first known victims of a man who would spend the next 31 years hiding in plain sight. Wichita, Kansas, in the early 1970s, was the kind of city that felt insulated from the chaos happening elsewhere in America. Vietnam was winding down. Watergate was fracturing the national trust in ways that would take a generation to fully process. But Wichita had its aircraft manufacturing plants, Cessna, Beechcraft, Boeing's local operations, its flat grid of residential neighborhoods, its church communities and school districts, and the particular quiet of a place that believed with some evidence that it was safe. Population around 270,000. Large enough to be anonymous if you wanted to be. Small enough that people still recognized their neighbors at the grocery store, still waved from driveways, still left side doors unlocked during the day. Dennis Lynn Rader was 30 years old in January 1974. He had grown up in Wichita, the oldest of 4 brothers, raised in a working-class household in the Park City area, just north of the city proper. He had attended Kansas State University at Pittsburgh, studying electronics, then served 4 years in the United States Air Force, stationed at bases in Alabama and South Korea and Guam. He had come home to Wichita and married a woman named Paula Dietz in May 1971. They were living in a small house in the area. He had a job at a local grocery distribution company. He went to church, Park City Lutheran, a congregation he had attended since childhood, and would eventually lead as president of the church council. He was, by every visible measure, a man in the process of building an ordinary life. A young husband, a churchgoer, a veteran. That invisibility was not accidental. It was, in a sense, his primary skill. On the morning of January 15th, 1974, a 15-year-old boy named Charlie Otero walked home from school early because he was not feeling well. The temperature in Wichita that day was in the low 20s. He came up the front walk of his family's house at 803 North Edgemore Street, a modest single-story home in a residential neighborhood of similar houses, similar lawns, similar families, pushed open the front door, and found his parents and two of his siblings dead inside. Joseph Otero was 38 years old, a retired Air Force sergeant who had moved the family to Wichita from Puerto Rico the previous year. He was found in the bedroom, bound and strangled, a plastic bag over his head. Julie Otero, his wife, was 34. She was found in the same room, bound, strangled. Their son Joey, 9 years old, was found in his bedroom, bound and strangled, a plastic bag secured around his neck with a cord. Their daughter Josephine, 11 years old, had been taken to the basement. She had been hanged from a pipe in the ceiling with a nylon cord. She was wearing her socks. Her feet did not reach the floor. The other three Otero children, Charlie and two others, had gone to school that morning and come home to a crime scene that would define the rest of their lives. The Wichita Police Department had never seen anything like it. There was no obvious motive. Nothing significant had been stolen from the house. A small amount of cash, a radio, items of no particular value. The Oteros had no known enemies, no criminal history, no disputes with neighbors. They were a family that had been in Wichita for less than a year. Investigators worked the scene carefully, documented everything they could, and came up against a wall almost immediately. No usable fingerprints, no reliable witnesses. A cut phone line outside the house that told them the attacker had planned ahead, but told them nothing about who the attacker was. For 8 months, the case sat open and cold, and without answers. Then, in October 1974, a letter arrived at the Wichita Eagle. It had not been mailed in the conventional sense. It had been hidden inside a mechanical engineering textbook at the Wichita Public Library, placed there deliberately, waiting to be found. The letter described details of the Otero murders that had never been released to the public. Specific details, accurate details, the kind that only someone present at the scene could have known. At the end of the letter, the writer asked a question. What name should the press give him? He offered a suggestion of his own. He called himself BTK. He explained that those 3 letters stood for bind, torture, kill. He explained that those 3 words described his method. He was not asking for understanding or sympathy. He was not expressing remorse. He was announcing himself, formally, deliberately, with the organizational logic of someone filing a report. The Wichita Police Department now knew 2 things they had not known before. The Otero murders were not an isolated event in the mind of the person who committed them. And whoever had done it was controlled enough, patient enough, to wait 9 months before making contact, and then to choose a library as his drop point, a place with no surveillance cameras in 1974, a place where hundreds of people passed through every day, and no one would remember one more person browsing the stacks. What investigators did not know, could not know yet, was that BTK had already killed again. 3 months before that letter arrived at the Eagle in April 1974, a 21-year-old woman named Catherine Bright had been attacked in her home on East 13th Street. She was killed. Her brother Kevin, who had been with her that afternoon and had no connection to whatever BTK had planned, was shot twice in the face at close range. He survived. He managed to escape the house and flag down help on the street outside, bleeding and barely conscious. Kevin Bright became one of the very few people who survived a direct encounter with BTK and lived to describe what had happened. His description of his attacker was partial, filtered through shock and blood loss, and the particular distortion of extreme violence. It was something. It was not enough. The killings continued with a rhythm that defied prediction. There was no consistent interval, no geographic pattern that investigators could use to anticipate the next attack. March 1977. Shirley Vian, 26 years old, killed in her home on North Hydraulic Street. Her 3 young children were in the house. BTK locked them in a bathroom before he killed their mother. He had brought rope and plastic bags and cord. He had planned it. December 1977. Nancy Fox, 25 years old, a jewelry store clerk who lived alone in an apartment on South Pershing. She was strangled in her bedroom. After he killed her, BTK drove to a gas station several blocks away and used the payphone to call the Wichita Police Department. He gave the dispatcher the address. He said there had been a homicide. He hung up. The recording of that call still exists. His voice on it is flat, almost administrative, the tone of someone completing a task on a checklist. In 1978, he wrote again, this time to KAKE-TV, a local television station. The letter described his killings in clinical detail and expressed in language that revealed something important about his psychology, frustration that the police were not taking him seriously enough. He complained about the coverage. He felt he was not being given appropriate recognition. He had constructed an identity around these acts. BTK was not just a name he had invented, it was a persona he inhabited, a role he had assigned himself, and he needed that identity to be witnessed and acknowledged by the outside world. The letters were not just communication, they were performance. They were the work of a man who needed an audience as much as he needed anything else. The Wichita Police Department assembled a task force, officers from multiple divisions, FBI support, behavioral science consultation from Quantico. They received thousands of tips over the following years, names submitted by neighbors, co-workers, ex-spouses, people with grudges, and people with genuine concern. They followed hundreds of leads. They interviewed people across the city and the surrounding region. BTK had left almost nothing behind that the forensic technology of the 1970s could process. No usable fingerprints. DNA analysis was a decade away from being a practical investigative tool. Witness descriptions were inconsistent and incomplete. The task force worked for years and came up against the same wall the original investigators had hit in 1974. In 1979, BTK selected a woman named Anna Williams as a target. He researched her. He broke into her home on South Pershing Street and waited for her to return. She didn't come home when he expected her to. He waited for a period of time that he would later describe in communications, then left. He was not caught. He was not seen. And then he did something that no investigator had anticipated. He sent Anna Williams a poem, mailed directly to her home, describing, in his own organized and clinical language, what he had planned to do to her and why he had left without doing it. Anna Williams had no idea who had sent it or why she had been chosen. She moved out of her house within weeks. He had already moved on to whatever came next in his mind. And then, with no warning and no public explanation, BTK went quiet. The years passed with the particular weight of unresolved things. The task force was scaled back as resources were redirected, and the leads dried up. The Wichita Eagle ran occasional retrospectives, anniversary pieces, updates that contained no new information because there was no new information. Criminologists and FBI behavioral analysts who had studied the case offered theories about why an active serial killer might stop. Death, incarceration for an unrelated crime, relocation to another city, or the possibility that the compulsions had simply burned themselves out. None of those theories were wrong in general. All of them were wrong about Dennis Rader specifically. Dennis Rader had not stopped because he was dead or imprisoned or relocated. He had a daughter born in 1978 and a son born in 1975. He had changed jobs. He would eventually become a compliance officer for Park City, the small municipality just north of Wichita, where he had grown up, driving around in a city vehicle, citing residents for code violations, writing up reports on tall grass and abandoned vehicles, and improperly maintained fences. He held authority in his church. He was a Boy Scout leader. He was, by every external measure, a man embedded in his community, in all the ways a man can be embedded. But the compulsion did not go away. In cases like this, it does not go away. It recedes, sometimes for years, and then it returns. In 1985, a 62-year-old woman named Maureen Hedge disappeared from her home on Independence Street in Park City. Her house was on the same block as Dennis Rader's house. She was his neighbor. Her body was found in a ditch 11 days later, in a rural area south of the city. She had been strangled. BTK had killed her, transported her body in her own car to a church, a different church, not his own, where he staged and photographed her, then moved her again to the ditch where she was found. He kept the photographs. He had been keeping photographs and other materials from his crimes for years, stored in locations he controlled, organized in the same methodical way he organized everything else. In 1986, a 28-year-old woman named Vicki Wegerle was killed in her home on West 13th Street in Wichita. BTK had posed as a telephone repairman to gain entry. Her husband Robert came home that afternoon to find her dying on the living room floor. Robert Wegerle was immediately considered a suspect, a pattern that BTK would later acknowledge in his written communications that he had counted on. The suspicion against Robert Wegerle lasted for years, through the investigation and beyond, a secondary injury inflicted on a man who had already lost his wife. Vicki Wegerle's case was not officially connected to BTK for nearly 2 decades. In 1991, 62-year-old Dolores Davis was abducted from her home on North Independence in Park City in the early hours of a January morning. Her body was found under a bridge on 53rd Street North approximately 2 weeks later. She had been strangled. She was the last person Dennis Rader killed. After 1991, the silence stretched out again. A decade passed, then most of another decade. The task force was formally dissolved. Investigators who had spent significant portions of their careers on the BTK case retired or moved to other assignments. The city of Wichita carried the memory of BTK the way communities carry unresolved things. As a low, persistent background frequency, the knowledge that someone had done these things and had never been found, and that he was, in all statistical probability, still alive and still somewhere. In 2004, something changed. The Wichita Eagle published a 30th anniversary retrospective on the BTK case. It was substantial journalism, detailed, carefully reported, naming the victims, summarizing the evidence, reviewing the investigation's history, and noting plainly that BTK had never been identified. It did what anniversary journalism does. It kept the record visible, reminded the city of what had happened, honored the victims by refusing to let their cases fade entirely into the archive. For Dennis Rader, now 60 years old, still working as a compliance officer for Park City, still attending Christ Lutheran Church, still living in the same general geography he had occupied for his entire adult life. The article was something different. It was a reminder that his story was not being told correctly, that the author of all of this had never received credit for his authorship, that BTK existed in the public record as a mystery, a question without an answer, rather than as the specific and organized and deliberate person he understood himself to be. In March 2004, a package arrived at the Wichita Police Department. Inside was a photocopy of Vicki Wegerle's driver's license and 3 photographs. The photographs showed Vicki Wegerle at the scene of her 1986 murder. They showed things that only someone present at that scene could have documented. Only the killer had taken those photographs. Only the killer had kept them for 18 years and then chosen this moment to send them. BTK was back. Over the next 11 months, he sent 11 separate communications to police and local media, letters in padded envelopes, a cereal box left in a park near a UPS drop containing items he had taken from victims, a self-addressed stamped postcard asking investigators to confirm receipt of his materials. The organizational instinct of a man who wanted to know his correspondence was being processed. He used public computers at libraries and copy shops to compose documents. He chose drop locations that were difficult to surveil and impossible to stake out in advance. He was careful. He was also, in a way that became increasingly clear in retrospect, performing again, writing himself back into a story that had, in his estimation, forgotten him. Investigators handled this with considerable care. They established a public communication protocol, responding to his contacts through press releases, maintaining a controlled conversation through the media, designed to keep him communicating without giving him anything operationally useful. They were aware that the DNA evidence that had been unprocessable in 1974 was now a viable tool. Any biological material he sent could potentially be analyzed. They were also aware that he was intelligent, organized, and had evaded detection for 30 years. They moved deliberately. The DNA from materials he sent was tested. It was male. It was consistent across samples. It was not in any existing database. It was a profile, not a name. Then, in January 2005, he sent a postcard to KSAS-TV asking a specific question. Could a floppy disk be traced back to its sender? The station, in coordination with the Wichita Police Department and the FBI, responded publicly that a disk would not be traceable. That response was not true. On February 16, 2005, the padded envelope arrived at KSAS-TV, purple floppy disk, single-word document. Investigators opened the file and checked the metadata within minutes. The document had last been edited by a user named Dennis. The software license was registered to Christ Lutheran Church in Park City, Kansas. The Google search took 30 seconds. Dennis Rader, Church Council President, Park City. Investigators did not move immediately. They spent the following days and weeks building the case methodically, pulling records, running background checks, confirming employment history, establishing that Dennis Rader had lived in Park City continuously since before 1974. They needed a DNA sample. They could not take one from Rader directly without tipping him that he was under investigation. But his daughter had received a routine pap smear examination at a Kansas State University health clinic some years earlier, and that sample had been retained in storage as part of standard medical record keeping. Investigators obtained it through legal process. The DNA extracted from that sample was compared against the profile built from materials BTK had sent. The familial match was close enough, statistically, biologically, to confirm that the BTK samples had come from a first-degree biological relative of the woman who had provided that medical sample. Combined with the metadata, the employment records, the geographic history, and 30 years of investigative context, it was enough. On February 25, 2005, at approximately 12:30 in the afternoon, Dennis Rader was pulled over in his car near his home in Park City. Multiple law enforcement vehicles, officers from the Wichita Police Department and the FBI. He was taken into custody without incident. He did not resist. He did not attempt to flee. According to accounts from investigators present at the arrest, he seemed almost calm. The particular calm of someone who has been carrying something very heavy for a very long time, and has finally, in whatever sense the word applies, set it down. The interrogation that followed lasted hours and extended across multiple sessions. Rader was cooperative in a way that investigators found simultaneously useful and profoundly unsettling. He answered questions with the precision of someone who had been organizing these answers in his mind for years, or perhaps for decades. He used his own terminology throughout: project for a planned killing, hit for a completed one. The same language that appeared in his written communications. He described each of the 10 murders in sequence, correcting investigators when their details differed from his memory, volunteering information they had not asked for, filling in gaps that had been open in the case files since 1974. He described the planning he had done before January 15th, 1974, how he had watched the Otero house on Edgemore Street over a period of days, how he had cut the phone line before entering, how he had knocked on the door. He described what happened inside with the same flat, organized tone that had appeared in his letters and in that 1977 phone call to police. He talked about Josephine Otero, 11 years old, and the basement. He talked about Shirley Vian's children, locked in the bathroom, and what they must have heard through the door. He talked about Nancy Fox, and Maureen Hedge, and Vicki Wegerle, and Dolores Davis. He accounted for all 10 victims across 17 years of killings. He filled in details that had been missing for 3 decades. He also talked about what he called the factor, his own word for the compulsion he described as something separate from the rest of his personality, something that ran alongside his ordinary life without, in his telling, touching it. He described a fantasy life that had begun in childhood and had escalated over decades in specificity and intensity. He described projects he had planned and not carried out, targets he had selected, homes he had entered, situations he had walked away from for reasons of timing or risk. The number of near misses he described suggested that the 10 known murders represented a subset of what he had attempted, not the full boundary of his intent. There was no apparent remorse in the room during those sessions. There was something that investigators described, in later interviews and informal accounts, as closer to relief and something closer to pride. And those two things were wound together in a way that was difficult to separate and perhaps impossible to fully understand from the outside. The formal charges came in June 2005. 10 counts of first-degree murder. Dennis Rader was 60 years old. His attorney entered discussions with the Sedgwick County District Attorney's Office, and the decision was made to proceed through guilty pleas rather than a full jury trial, a process that would allow the facts of each murder to be entered into the official record with Rader's direct acknowledgement. On June 27, 2005, Rader appeared in a Sedgwick County courtroom before Judge Gregory Waller. He entered guilty pleas on all 10 counts. What followed over the next several hours was not a trial in the adversarial sense, but a formal proceeding in which the facts of each murder were read aloud, and Rader was given the opportunity to respond. He responded at length. He described each case in sequence with the same methodical precision he had shown in interrogation. He used hand-drawn diagrams to illustrate certain details. He corrected the record on points where official accounts differed from his recollection. He spoke for a long time, in a courtroom that was entirely silent except for his voice. Survivors of victims sat in the gallery. Kevin Bright, who had been shot twice in 1974 and had spent 31 years knowing that his sister, Catherine's killer, was still free, was there. Family members of the Otero children who had survived were there. People who had grown up in Wichita during the years of the BTK investigation, who had locked their doors and changed their routines and lived with the low background frequency of that unresolved threat, were there. What they heard was not what most of them had expected, not breakdown, not emotional confession, a man organizing his own archive out loud in a courtroom with diagrams. Judge Waller sentenced Dennis Rader to 10 consecutive life sentences. Kansas had abolished the death penalty in 1994, 11 years before Rader's arrest, which meant that capital punishment was not an available option regardless of the severity of the crimes. The sentence carried a minimum of 175 years before parole eligibility, a number that was, in practical terms, a life sentence without using those exact words. Dennis Rader was transported to El Dorado Correctional Facility in Butler County, Kansas, approximately 30 miles east of Wichita. He has been there since 2005. He is now in his early 80s. He has given interviews to journalists and researchers. He has continued to write letters. He has, by multiple accounts maintained in prison, the same organized self-referential quality that defined everything he did on the outside, filing legal motions, corresponding with people who study his case, expressing in at least one documented instance frustration that he does not have more access to write. Paula Rader, his wife of 34 years, filed for divorce immediately following his arrest. The divorce was granted on an emergency basis within days, one of the fastest emergency divorce proceedings in Kansas court history, granted on grounds that the continuation of the marriage posed a direct threat to her mental and emotional health. She has spoken publicly only rarely in the years since, and when she has, the accounts suggest a woman processing something that does not have a clean resolution. 34 years of marriage to a man she did not know, a life built on a foundation that turned out to be something else entirely. Their children have largely remained out of public view. They were, by all available evidence, as blindsided as anyone. The 10 victims: Joseph Otero, 38, Julie Otero, 34, Joey Otero, 9, Josephine Otero, 11, Catherine Bright, 21, Shirley Vian, 26, Nancy Fox, 25, Maureen Hedge, 62, Vicky Wegerle, 28, Dolores Davis, 62, were killed across a span of 17 years, in their own homes, in a city where they had every reason to believe they were safe. The youngest was a child. Several of them had children of their own, who survived and grew up without them. Kevin Bright, shot and left for dead in April 1974, has spoken publicly in the years since about his sister Catherine and about the 31 years he spent knowing the man who killed her was still somewhere in the world, still free, still invisible. The Wichita Police Department and the FBI have both conducted formal reviews of the BTK investigation in the years since 2005. Those reviews have been frank about the limitations of 1970s forensic technology and about the structural challenges of investigating a killer who had no consistent relationship to his victims, who planned carefully, who left minimal physical evidence, and who was embedded in a community in ways that made him functionally invisible to the people around him. They have also been frank about the floppy disk, about the fact that the answer to the question, can a disk be traced, was yes, that this was known at the time, and that the decision to answer that question publicly with a no was a deliberate investigative strategy. It worked. Retired Detective Ken Landwehr, who led the BTK task force in its final years and who was present at Rader's arrest in February 2005, has spoken in interviews about the moment the metadata came back from the disk. He has described it with the particular measured quality of someone who has processed something enormous and is still, years later, processing it. 30 years, 11 communications, a floppy disk, a Word document, a name in a metadata field. There is a specific kind of horror in the BTK case that is different from other serial killer cases, and it lives not in the violence itself, but in the ordinariness surrounding it. Dennis Rader drove through Park City in a city vehicle and cited residents for tall grass and broken fences and improperly stored vehicles. He held church office. He organized scout activities. He attended neighborhood functions. He lived on a street where he had killed one of his neighbors and driven away in her car. The people he cited for code violations had no idea. His congregation had no idea. His family had no idea. He sat in the same pews, attended the same community meetings, drove the same streets for decades after the killings, and nothing in his exterior life indicated anything at all. The compliance work investigators and psychologists have noted was not incidental to his psychology. The job gave him something he needed: authority, the ability to enter private spaces on official business, the power to compel people to respond to him. He had chosen that work. He was good at it. He used the same organizational logic in his case files that he used in his projects, the same methodical approach, the same attention to documentation, the same need to have a record that confirmed what he had done. The letters and packages he sent between 2004 and 2005 have been studied extensively by investigators, behavioral analysts, and researchers. They do not show a man who was deteriorating or becoming erratic. They show a man who was, if anything, more organized and more deliberate than he had been in the 1970s. He made one mistake. He trusted that the technology had not caught up to him. It had, and had been capable of catching him for years before he sent that disk. The purple floppy disk is now part of the evidence archive of the Sedgwick County District Attorney's Office. The padded envelope, the Word document, the metadata field with a name, all of it preserved. It is the kind of detail that feels almost disproportionately small for the weight of what it resolved. 31 years, thousands of interviews, hundreds of thousands of investigative hours and dollars, and in the end, a man who did not understand what a Word document remembered, and who trusted a television station's public answer to a question about traceability. Dennis Rader understood that he was intelligent. He understood that he was careful. He understood that he had evaded detection for longer than almost any identified serial killer in the history of American law enforcement. What he did not allow himself to understand, or could not, was that the same impulse that had driven him to communicate, to be recognized, to send letters and packages and postcards and floppy disks, to perform his own authorship for an audience that didn't yet know who the author was. That impulse was the thing that made him findable. He wanted to be known. He needed to be known. He had needed it since October 1974, when he hid a letter in a library book and waited for someone to find it. In the end, he was known, completely, on the record, in a courtroom in Sedgwick County, Kansas, with diagrams. If this case stayed with you, the decades of silence, the ordinary life alongside the hidden one, the single mistake at the end of 31 years, there's another one waiting on this channel. A case where the answers took just as long to surface, and where the person hiding in plain sight was just as close to the people looking for him. It's already there.